The Bible is filled with some of the best villains ever. Think of Jezebel or Goliath, or how about the greatest villain of all, Lucifer? But hands down, I think that the one villain that we all secretly love to hate has to be the Pharisees. My goal with this talk is I want to defend the Pharisees. I want to argue that the Pharisees may not be as bad as we often think of them, and they may actually be good guys when it comes to the creation of this marvelous book called the Bible. Because I don't think we would even recognize the Old Testament if it weren't for the Pharisees, even though they're largely in the New Testament. Now, I don't know if you've ever been a part of a big play like an Easter pageant. Everyone loves to play the part of a Pharisee because what other part allows you to be a monster and stay in character? But the truth is, the people admired the Pharisees. They didn't dislike them at all. They viewed them as respectable. They viewed them as honorable. They viewed them as heroes, really. And that hero status had been with them for a long time, and they had earned it. Now, where did the Pharisees come from? Well, there's a lot of debate over that, but I think in some ways their origin began a little bit in the year 721 BC. That was the year the Assyrians attacked the 10 northern tribes of Israel. Now, David was king, and he then bestowed the kingship to his son Solomon. And we like to think of Solomon as the wisest man who ever lived. And he was a wise man for sure. But toward the end of his life, he wasn't always the wisest king. He made a lot of mistakes. He had an awful lot of wives, an awful lot of concubines, and he didn't always treat his people kindly. So when Solomon died, the people came to Solomon's son, Rehoboam, and they said, "Please, can you treat us a little kinder than your father did?" And when Rehoboam said, "No, my father whipped you with whips, I'm going to whip you with scorpions." I don't know exactly how you do that, but that didn't win the people over. And so the 10 northern tribes, they separated and became a nation unto itself called Israel. In the south, there were 2 tribes that remained loyal to the house of David. And that would be the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. Thus they called that nation Judea because the tribe of Benjamin was so small that it really didn't have a major foothold. And in time, that tribe even melded into the tribe of Judah. That's where we get the term Jews, is from the tribe of Judah. But in the year 721, the Assyrians, the Mesopotamians, if you will, came in and they completely swept through the northern kingdom of Israel and took many of their people captive. And then they did something very clever. They moved in peoples from all nations into the land of Israel. And the people intermarried with them. And what happens when you intermarry that widely is many of their traditions, many of their identities, and most importantly, many of their religious ideas and values began to dissipate. Until finally, those 10 northern tribes essentially disappeared. At the time of Jesus, the 10 northern tribes are there as a kind of shadow, and that would be the Samaritans. The Samaritans are really all that remained of the 10 northern tribes, but they weren't pure children of Abraham. They were actually children of Abraham and many, many other nations. That's the reason why the Jews in the time of Jesus really disliked the Samaritans. Not because they were Gentiles, but because they really weren't Gentiles. Rather, it's because they were something worse. They were half-breeds. They were half children of Abraham and half Gentile. So kind of racism, if you will, is what kind of fed into that hatred of Samaritans. The 10 northern tribes essentially went away. They're gone. Many of them may have gone down to Ethiopia. Many of them may have gone other places. But for the most part, the 10 northern tribes are gone. So that left only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. And that's when the Babylonians came in. The Babylonians then came in the year 587 to about 586. And they sacked Jerusalem, and they did something extraordinarily intelligent. They took the best and the brightest of the young people, and they took them back to Babylon. And we know these stories in many ways because there are some very famous Jews or children of Abraham who went to Babylon. People like Daniel, people like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, here is where I believe the Pharisees really began to evolve, because the Pharisees remembered what happened to those 10 northern tribes. They remember that people came and the children of Abraham intermarried with other nations, and that people began to lose their religion. And so the Pharisees, they were a people that were determined to help the children to keep their religion, keep their traditions, keep their old ways, to keep the law of Moses. And so during that captivity, this group that was not yet called Pharisees, but was a group called the separated ones. Well, they began to create what we called synagogues. Now, we think of modern day synagogues as a kind of church for our Jewish community, but that's not what the separated ones intended for synagogues. They were schools. They were schools while in captivity to help the people remember their history, to help the people remember their traditions, to help the people, most importantly, to remember the books of Moses, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so they taught and they taught their scriptures. The people knew their scriptures incredibly well. Many of the people who were living and were born into captivity knew their scriptures more than people who had been living in Judea before that, because it was of such value. When the people finally returned back to Jerusalem, back to Judea, this group of people, the Pharisees, which means the separated ones, well, they became national heroes. After all, they had essentially saved a nation. They had managed to save a culture. They had managed to save an entire religion. I personally believe that God used this group of people, the Pharisees, to preserve God's people, the Jews. Without them, there would not have been a nation for Jesus to have been born into. So already here, I think the Pharisees are kind of good guys. Now, one of the areas where perhaps we as Protestants miss out in is the last book in the Protestant Bible is the book of Malachi. And the time period between Malachi and the book of Matthew, the time period between the last book of the Old Testament and the first book of the New Testament, is over 400 years. So we as Protestants sometimes have this sense that nothing happened in those 400 years. Now, there are books written during those 400 years, and those are what we call the Apocrypha. And those you'll often find in a Catholic Bible. And there are some books in there that I think that Protestants should read. And that would be 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees. They tell a lot of the history of this period. And they read a little bit like 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, just telling a little bit about the very tragic, sometimes victorious history of the Jews in this period. Because there's a lot that happens. The Greeks move in. Later, the Romans move in. And who is it that keeps the people loyal to the nation? Who is it that keeps the people loyal to their faith? Well, it's the Pharisees. So I would actually go so far as to say that the Pharisees helped to invent the Judaism that existed when Jesus was born. And that sounds like a bad thing, because the Gospels treat the Pharisees pretty harshly. But are they really so bad? Think about this for a moment. The Pharisees were not irrational in their concerns about Jesus, because the Pharisees had witnessed messiahs before. In the year 6 AD, there was a Messiah whose name was Judas of Galilee. Now, Judas of Galilee would have been a contemporary of Jesus. Jesus would have been a young boy when Judas was going about the country, whipping people up into an anti-Roman fury, proclaiming himself to be the Messiah and saying that we could take the chains off of our necks of the Romans and we could have our independence back. Well, Rome did not take kindly to this rebellion. They never took kindly to a rebellious spirit, and they didn't take kindly to Judas of Galilee. So in the year 6 AD, the Romans brought their troops in and they squelched this little rebellion that took place. And as a result, the Romans crucified 10,000 Jews. They just lined the roads with cross after cross after cross. There wasn't enough wood to crucify all the people. And so they would crucify 2 and 3 people on each cross. And they would crucify men and women. And Romans had a rule that if they crucified a man, that he would be facing outward. But if they crucified a woman, she would be facing inward. 10,000 crucified victims. It's not unlikely that many of the Pharisees who were alive at the time of Jesus, who were alive in the active years of Jesus' ministry, that many of those Pharisees would have remembered that. And so they would be nervous. They would be nervous about a new Messiah rising up and the people getting excited and huge crowds gathering around him. It was not irrational. But a lot of people, as I have said that Jesus, if he belonged to any sort of religious sect at all, which he did not, but if he did, the one that was closest to him would be the Pharisees. Because you see, the Pharisees believed some doctrines that were unique in all of Judea. The Sadducees, they didn't believe that, because the Sadducees would be like the secular Jews of today. The Zealots didn't believe this because they were about being as pure and true to the Torah, to the books of Moses as possible. And then there were the Essenes, who were almost fanatical in their keeping of the law. They even had communes that would be for men only, just to make sure that they would stay pure. One thing about the Zealots, they were absolutely convinced that their religion called on them to rebel against Rome. Well, Jesus wasn't like them, but he was a lot like the Pharisees. Let me tell you a little bit about what the Pharisees would have taught. And tell me if this doesn't sound a lot like Jesus. First of all, the Pharisees, unlike anyone else in Judea, had a definite belief in life after death. Now, it's not to say that the others didn't believe there was life after death. It was just not as sure as the Pharisees were. They were sure that there was going to be an afterlife and they would spend eternity with God. They also believed that salvation was not just for Jews. They believed that salvation was also extended to the Gentiles. But here's a problem. According to the Pharisees, the way you are saved, if you will, is by being a child of Abraham. And you show that you're a child of Abraham through the act of circumcision. But what if you're from Ethiopia? Or what if you're from Macedonia? Or what if you are from Mesopotamia and you convert to Judaism? How are you possibly saved? You're not a child of Abraham. So they invented a beautiful ritual called baptism. Now, they didn't invent baptism, but they did invent the usage of it. You see, they would say that when you're baptized, you go down into the water and your old self would die. So if you were Ethiopian converting to Judaism, your Ethiopian self would die in the water and you would be born again as a child of Abraham. That's an expression invented by the Pharisees, to be born again. That is, to be born from above as a child of Abraham. Well, that sounds an awful lot like Jesus, doesn't it? They also believed in angels and demons. They actually had a very extensive angelology, if you will. The Pharisees even wrote very detailed commentaries on the Torah, like, for example, Talmud. And then they also wrote commentaries on the commentaries, such as Mishnah. Now, the commentaries that they wrote were not like our commentaries today. Our commentaries would go verse by verse by verse, explaining exactly what was meant, exactly what the historical details might be. But these Pharisee-written commentaries, such as the Mishnah, would be very speculative. It would be like, well, it might mean this, or perhaps this was taking place. Sometimes it would have a little play to it. And they didn't always agree, and they were actually okay with that, surprisingly enough. The other thing that the Pharisees had that none of the other Jewish sects had is they had a doctrine of divine providence. They believed that God was still actively involved in the actions of lives, that he was still actively helping people in their lives. Well, that sounds an awful lot like Jesus, doesn't it? I personally would argue that the reason why Jesus is so hard on the Pharisees is not because they're so wrong, but actually because they are almost right. Because the Pharisees then began to make a terrible blunder. They were so fearful that the people would fall into sin, that they might be like the 10 northern tribes and because of sin be wiped out. Or they might even be like the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. And because of sin, because of falling away from the law, that they would be taken into captivity. So they wanted the people to obey. So not only did they teach the law, but they began to surround the law with laws. Kind of like fences, if you will, hedges around the law, to make sure you don't even get close to breaking the law. So if the law says to keep the Sabbath, the Pharisees had laws to help make sure that you don't even come close to breaking the Sabbath. So if the Sabbath begins at sundown Friday and goes till sundown Saturday, well, they had rules to make sure that you started keeping Sabbath, maybe a couple hours before sundown. And maybe you would end Sabbath a couple hours after Sabbath. Well, if you think about that, the Pharisees' influence skyrocketed. They became so important because they preserved Judaism, because they were the ones who would fight against the Greeks, who would fight against the Romans, who would fight against heresies, and also because they were very involved in persuading the king to build the great second temple, the temple of Herod, and because they were actively involved in speaking out against false messiahs such as Judas of Galilee. So you can see why they're absolutely heroes to the people in Jesus' time. The people admired them. But I said at the beginning of this lecture that the Pharisees have an influence on the Old Testament and this book at large. How so? Here's how so. Now, we know that the Pharisees would send out missionaries out to convert people to Judaism. Jesus was a little critical of their techniques, but they did go out and try to proselytize people to become Jews. At the time of Jesus, people loved philosophy. This is the era of Greek philosophy. So the Pharisees began to compile books. They began to take some of the collected works of people like Solomon, people like whoever wrote Ecclesiastes and Job. And so we largely feel that the books of Proverbs, the apocryphal book of Baruch, the book of Ecclesiastes, and the book of Job were assembled together in the form they are today by the Pharisees. I think we have a great deal to be proud of the Pharisees in some ways. And that brings us, of course, to one of my favorite stories in the entire Bible. In John's Gospel, we have one of the most beautiful, powerful stories. Beautiful in its writing, beautiful in its message, and it's maybe the most familiar story with the most familiar verse in all of the Bible. It's John chapter 3. Now, the Gospel of John is the last of the Gospels, written probably late in John's life, perhaps even as late as 80 to 90 AD. So quite a bit later after Jesus and after all the other disciples are dead. So here's John, and he's remembering the things that he had learned, he had seen, and he's writing them down as an old man. And he alone tells this story of Nicodemus, a Pharisee. And it goes like this, John chapter 1. Now there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. And this man came to Jesus by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. Nicodemus already here is acknowledging that Jesus has much in common with the Pharisees. And he's even noticing that because of his miraculous power, that he's something special, perhaps even the Messiah. And then Jesus says something that startles him. He says, truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Now remember, to be born again is an expression coined by the Pharisees. Jesus is throwing a little Pharisee lingo at a Pharisee. And Nicodemus knows this. Nicodemus is not an idiot, but we sometimes treat him like one when we see his response. When he says, how can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? Nicodemus clearly doesn't think that's what Jesus means. As a matter of fact, Nicodemus understands very well that Jesus has come to talk theology, to talk shop. These, from the familiarity of the way they're talking to each other, I would venture to say that Jesus and Nicodemus have talked before, that they have actually developed a kind of friendship. And here, Jesus then reveals to Nicodemus perhaps the most succinct and beautiful expression of the gospel. Because it's to Nicodemus that he says, "For God so loved the world that whoever believes him will not perish but have everlasting life." And it's to a Pharisee that he says that God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but rather to save it through him. I think that as we read through the Bible, we'll notice that there are good guys and there are bad guys. And then there are people who are somewhere in between. We're not always sure. It's more complicated because the Pharisees are among some of the villains, but they're also among some of the good guys. Scripture tells us that many among the Pharisees followed him. As a matter of fact, some of the most important Christians were Pharisees. I can think of a few. Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, and then the little-known Pharisee named Saul of Tarsus, who, last I checked, contributed the majority of the New Testament. So when I think of the Bible, it's hard to imagine it without the contribution of the Pharisees. So next time you start to feel like the Pharisees are the bad guys of this story, maybe think twice, because they weren't all as bad as we think. And like I said, I don't think Jesus is so hard on them because they're so wrong. He's hard on them because they're almost right. And they almost get it, and a few of them do. Thank you.